Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Happy Hour webcast from WhiskyCast.com. It is Friday, April 16th. Hope you had a good week. We are going to have a lot of fun over the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. It all depends on you guys. The more questions you ask, the longer we'll go with our guest tonight, Brent Elliott from Four Roses. In just a second, you can contribute questions on the chat apps. If you're watching on YouTube, Twitch, or Facebook, we'd love to hear your questions and comments. If you're watching on Twitter, we won't see those comments until after the feed ends, but we'd still like to hear from you. I hope that, once again, this has been a good week for you. It has been a rough week for a lot of people. COVID's still with us. The shootings in Indianapolis, my hometown, last night. Our thoughts are with the folks in Indianapolis tonight, and Hopefully we get through COVID soon. I got my first shot the other day, and a couple, 3 weeks from now, getting the second shot. And then after that, maybe it might be time to start going out and visiting some distilleries. And when that happens, one of the first places I want to go is Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, to visit Brent Elliott and the entire team at Four Roses. Brent, how are you tonight?
Doing great, Mark. How are you doing?
Good. How are things going at the distillery in COVID time?
Everything's good here, as good as it could be expected. We've had to make a lot of adjustments with, of course, production both here and at the bottling facility, the warehouse facility. The biggest difference here is with the bourbon tourism. We've been closed down for the better part of the last year for all tours and tastings. We did open up a while back to retail, and we haven't announced it earlier this week. We opened up to tastings, but still no tours. So we are doing limited capacity tastings by reservation. So it's a baby step. I feel like it's a step in the right direction, but we're still not where we want to be with the tours, the full experience here at Four Roses.
And that's to keep your production people safe, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the employees, from the visitor center to production, just to keep everyone safe.
Explain, because there are folks who are understanding, well, why can't you do tours? And because that involves going back in the production areas, and you can keep the visitor center folks and the distillery folks apart. But if you start getting them together, that's when you have problems, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, there are some areas where, our tour is very up close and personal. You're in there, you're by the still, you're by the fermenters, you're walking through some very tight spaces. And these are work areas. So you're right there. If we had tours going through there, people would be in very close contact with workers and each other.
We are getting folks sharing their drinks tonight. Rob Landers has a Powers in hand, and Arland 058 also has a Powers Gold label in hand. Brent, what is in your glass tonight?
I have a little bit of small batch select.
As do I, a little bit of the small batch select here, and was really impressed with this one. This is the newest release, and it came out a couple of years ago, but you keep expanding the distribution each year. Is that because you're getting more of it in stock, or what?
Yeah, exactly. When we looked at the possibility of adding, extending our lineup of currently or always available products, it had been since 2006 since we released something like that, like a permanent extension, and that was with small batch. So in 2019, we realized that modern consumers changed a lot. People are looking for more variety, which is easy for us. With 10 recipes, we could easily create something new. So we wanted to work on the small batch concept, that platform, which is taking our recipes and doing them in different combinations. We also realized we want to do something higher strength and non-chill filtered. There's a lot of interest in higher proof and non-chill filtered bourbons now. But in 2019, we didn't have enough liquid to go nationwide. So we had to make the choice, or make the decision. Do we want to step it up and just add a few states, a few markets at a time, or wait? And we made the decision to go ahead and start putting out what we could. And so the first year, 2019, it was just 5 markets. And then we added more markets last year, and we're adding more this year. But fortunately, by the end of this year, we'll be in 30 states. So that's.
What about international?
None internationally. This is all for domestic. sales.
So we have to wait for the borders to open up again before our visitors over in Europe can get over here and get their hands on some, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
And I ask that because Chris Ratcliffe, our pal in London, and I am trying to find his comment here, admits that the only time he's ever had Four Roses was at Disneyland Paris, of all places. Four Roses seems to be widespread in France, and it really was. The original Four Roses bourbons were primarily export, and we should explain that for folks who don't understand that it was only really a few years ago that we got the good stuff back here in the States.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're an old brand. A lot of people in the U.S. maybe don't understand that because we were away from the U.S. market as a bourbon for so long. But we started in 1888. It was sold up to and through Prohibition. And then after Prohibition, it was purchased, the brand was purchased by Seagram's. And they continued selling Four Roses straight bourbon whiskey in the U.S. And they started exporting it primarily to Europe and Japan. And then in the late 50s, they went all in on the international markets. They took all the straight bourbon whiskey that had been Four Roses and focused it all in exports. Now, they kept Four Roses, the brand, in the U.S., but what was in the bottle was then a blended whiskey. So from the late 50s up until 2002, in the U.S., you couldn't get Four Roses bourbon. You could get Four Roses, but it wasn't anywhere close to Four Roses as we know it today, or as Europe and Japan have known it since the late 50s or since the 50s. So, but France is a big market. To give you some perspective, when I started in 2005, of all the European markets, Japan and Europe, the U.S. was at the very bottom of the list. We were just doing a few thousand cases. It was a very small volume. The biggest market at the time was Japan. The next biggest at that time was either Spain or France, and then all the European markets, and then at the bottom was the U.S. But then in 2015, the U.S. market overtook sales in Japan, and then it was either 16 or 17, the sales in the U.S. market overtook all of Europe combined. So, that's a mature market for us. France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and Japan, and the rest of the European countries. But so that's just a nice, healthy volume that isn't really changing much. But in the U.S., this is really where all the growth is for us.
I have to ask, how have the tariffs affected you guys the last couple of years? Since Chris Ratcliffe is also asking, those tariffs go up less than 50 days from now and 4 months from now on June 1st, or getting close to June 1st, rather. We're getting reasonably close to having those tariffs double. What would that do for you guys, besides make more whiskey available for the U.S.?
That's what I was going to say. We're feeling it, just like the rest of the industry. That big of an increase in cost, whether we absorb it or pass it along to the consumer, that's felt. And so we're seeing that, just like everyone else. So we're keeping a close eye on those tariffs, and hopefully sooner than later we can kind of reverse those tariffs and get back to the same healthy business we've always had in Europe.
Are there export Four Roses bottlings that we don't get in the United States?
Yeah, there are two, and those go to Japan only. There's the Four Roses Super Premium and the Fine Old Bourbon, or Black Label, as some people call it. And with those products, a lot of people look at those, especially with a name like Super Premium. They assume that because we're owned by Kirin, they're saving the best for the Japanese market, and that's not true at all. Actually, when we came back to the U.S., we didn't know what products would be sought after here, where we should begin. So of course we started with Four Roses bourbon, the bottle that used to be known as Yellow Label, but it's always really just been Four Roses bourbon, but because the label was yellow, that was kind of the nickname it got. So we started with that one, and then we introduced the single barrel into the U.S. And in 2006, when we came out with small batch, when we were looking at the portfolio, we knew that we wanted to expand. Super Premium was the first idea we had. We were actually going to bring that package and that liquid to the U.S. market, but we took the concept and the liquid to focus markets, and they didn't like it. And it's funny looking back, I wasn't at those focus groups, but what they didn't like about it was the fact that it's in a wine bottle. And people just at that time weren't familiar with, let's say, Pappy Van Winkle or some of these other bottles that are in a very similar bottle. That
Or
just
Booker's even.
Yeah, exactly. But with these focus groups, I guess people are more used to the more typical, square or bourbon style bottles. So it really didn't pass the test of the focus groups. So we went to the drawing board and created small batch, the package, the concept, everything from scratch. And I'm glad we did because I personally love small batch, and because that was the beginning of that small batch platform because I'm always talking about, we're always trying to communicate our uniqueness with 10 recipes. And that's really the best vehicle for us to really put those products in consumers' hands and explain why they're different. So we do that with the limited edition small batch, the standard small batch, and then with the small batch select. That's sort of the idea behind the small batch concept.
And we have to give a lot of the credit for this to your predecessor, the one and only Jim Rutledge, because he was the one who convinced Kieran to bring Four Roses back to the U.S. and do it right.
Absolutely. He'd been trying to get Four Roses back through Seagram's for years. As he was familiar with the brand, he knew the quality, he knew how well it would do in the U.S. market. So when Kieran came over, when they sent the first group of ambassadors, when we were doing the transition of ownership, that was the first question he asked them. And they said yes. And it really is a testament to that. That wasn't really a business decision on their end. Really, they bought the brand so that they could retain the rights to distribute in Japan because it's such a big brand there, and they were distributing it for us. So when they said yes, that was really just an act of goodwill to Jim and the employees here at Four Roses, because they had no idea that this was the future of bourbon was going to be in the U.S., that we were right there just a few years away from this bourbon boom that we've all been experiencing. So it was a decision that was really made out of pure kindness, and I think was paid back, because it was an excellent business decision. As I mentioned, this is where the majority of our growth is here in the U.S.
So what is the difference between that super premium and the whiskeys that we're getting in the U.S., the core range? Is it in the recipe, the yeast style, maturation, or all of the above?
All of the above. The combination of recipes is unique to that. It's both mash bills, and then it's the K yeast and the V yeast. And it's a little bit older than our standard releases here in the U.S. It's a minimum of 8 years, and it has to be at least 20% 10-year or older bourbon. And it's 43%. So, and that's, I don't know how well that would be received in the U.S., having bourbon that old, but still cut down to that proof. Because, there's that trend now that, a lot of people won't even look at a whiskey if it's not barrel strength or 100 proof or above. So I think I enjoy lower proof bourbons. I mean, you kind of have to drink those neat. You can't really put any water or rocks with them, but it's a nice combination. It's a very nice, very mellow bourbon, and it drinks well at 43%. And the other one we have, the fine old bourbon, that is actually pretty similar from a formulary and age standpoint to our small batch. The small batch is 4 recipes. Both mash bills, it's the K yeast, which is spicy, and the O yeast. The fine old bourbon is just the K yeast with both mash bills. So it's kind of like small batch without that extra bit of fruit.
And our pal Tyrone Cote in Nova Scotia wants to know if you guys could do a super duper premium for Canada.
You never know.
I know he's kidding, but what's available in Canada from Four Roses? Do you send the whole lineup up there, or what?
Yeah, they get the small batch, the single barrel, and the Four Roses bourbon.
Now, we have a somewhat of a snarky question here, and of course, when we think of snark, we think of Crump Crumpler in terms of comments around here. He wants to know what you think of making small batch more than a marketing term, and coming up with an actual definition for what really defines a small batch, because it's basically whatever a distillery wants to call it.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and it's all relative. A small batch to us could be a year's production for a small distillery. and a big batch for us could be a small batch for larger distillers. So it's all relative, and there is no definition. So no, it's not. Single barrel is easy to define. It is what it is. Small batch, again, there's no consensus on how to define that. So it would be interesting to see how that would be defined. You would inevitably make some people happy, some people upset, no matter what kind of volume you put on that. So it'd be interesting to see if that ever happens, because ours, people ask me all the time, how big is your small batch? And honestly, when it started out, it was about 17 barrels. And the way we did it was by the flavor profile. It's hand selecting the batches, handcrafting the final product. And we still do that, but the batch is much bigger than 17 barrels now. It could be 200 or more barrels for each batch. So really the handcraftedness, and I feel it makes it small batch compared to our big batch, which is the Four Roses Bourbon, is all the effort that goes into hand selecting the batches that go into it, doing test blends to make sure that it's consistent and it meets the standards that, the higher standards that people expect from small batch.
Our friends in Canada are weighing in right now. Watchman 999 is in Calgary and says the single barrel is not available in Alberta, but it should be. And you got to talk to your local retailers. Talk to Kensington Wine Market. Talk to Andrew there, because they can get stuff into Calgary and Alberta that nobody else in Canada can get because of the way the system is set up right now. And Crumpler says it's one of the few times he wasn't actually trying to be snarky for once. Whiskey Canuck in Quebec says that they need to get Four Roses in Quebec. Off topic, mentioning Four Roses always makes him think of Five Roses Flower because their old building is a local landmark and not that far away from him. And Watchman 99 says Yellow Label and Small Batch have been cited in Calgary. I have proof in my cabinet, and I'm sure you appreciate that, Brent. Tyrone Coty is going, Watchman 99, we can do an exchange. Let's hope Canadian Post is not watching that one. Spirit Bomb Tabitha, Four Roses should be available in UK supermarkets. It's one of the few bourbons that she actually likes. And that's a compliment coming from Tabitha, because we know she loves single malts, especially Japanese whiskeys. And that really is the link here. The Japanese really saved bourbon in a lot of ways, not just with Four Roses, but with other brands as well, just by buying it up during the 70s and 80s when the rest of the world didn't care about bourbon.
Absolutely. And that was about the time period that, we were already there. And I think that's when super premium was developed. It was really to capitalize. We had the liquid and there was that demand. And I think a lot of brands looked to Japan in that time period to, there's all this aging whiskey, and, the trends always fluctuate up and down. And anytime it goes down, everyone's looking to find an outlet for that whiskey. And you're right, Japan saved the industry at that time. I think it would still exist, but it was really a lifeline in a time where the rest of the demand in many parts of the world kind of dried up.
Dave Kuhn has an interesting comment. Some people, he quoted you, some people won't touch it unless it's 100 proof or higher. That's a trend Dave points out where some people think cask strength is inherently better. Does that drive you to bottle younger but stronger stuff, or do you just go ahead and bottle it when you think it's ready and when it meets the taste profile?
Yeah, for all of our products, you'll notice we don't have age statements on anything, but we still have our internal minimums for everything, and we communicate them. Like our Four Roses Bourbon is at least 5 years, small batch select is at least 6, single barrel is at least 7. So we haven't changed any of the ages on any of our products. And really the only thing that we've adjusted, or that we do adjust or we don't adjust, but anything that can fluctuate in proof would be like the limited editions or the private selections. And really that's just a function of what tier it's on. And even our warehouses that are just 6 stories or 6 barrels high, they're pretty consistent in aging up to like 7 to 8 years. But for the private barrel program, those are 8 to 12 years old. And even in our warehouses that are consistent or very consistent in temperature, we'll start to see a difference in characteristics, and proof being a big one, that far out, because the higher up in the warehouse, the hotter the temperatures, the more water you lose, and the higher the proof gets. So we see a lot of that in our private barrel program, where people are seeking the higher proof barrels, the higher tier barrels. They could be 120 to 135, somewhere in there. The lower tier barrels, some people appreciate them. I personally like barrels about 105 to 110. For me, that's really the sweet spot. But to answer your question, no, we haven't changed. We haven't changed the age on anything, tried to finagle it by increasing the proof to meet that demand. Everything has been maintained.
I'm going to bring up a question here, or a comment from Crumpler, and this is going to start some trouble here, I suspect, but I got to find it here. Let's irritate Mark by discussing the irrefutable truth of the neck pour. I got to ask, I'm going to put you on the spot, Brent. Have you ever heard of the neck pour?
No, but I'm interested. What's the neck pour?
Supposedly and this bottle's been opened, but supposedly there are a few bourbon, I'm using the term air quotes here, experts who claim that little top bit of whiskey at the top of the bottle gets affected by air, and that it goes bad. It oxidizes compared to the rest of the bottle, when what you're looking at when you actually pour it is so much of this changes around that it's not going to make a big difference. But these guys are swearing up and down that first little top bit of bourbon ought to be thrown out of a bottle when it's brand new, because it's been sitting and not getting moved around in the bottle and being exposed, and it's been exposed to air inside the bottle. And there's a word I'd like to use for this, and I can't use that word on this broadcast. But as a distilling expert, what's your take on this?
That's tough. I mean, maybe if you had a liquid, you can't really see it, but there's a lot of that Brownian motion, or whatever you want to call it, where the molecules are always moving, continually mixing. So I don't see, it's fluid. It is a fluid. I don't see it, if the exchange with the atmosphere, maybe with the cork, you will get some of that. It's very slight, but if you extrapolate anything, it can be significant. So you're going to lose volume in a corked bottle over decades. But that's so slow. I mean, the motion of the molecules in the liquid, that's slow too, but I think the evaporation or the exchange with the atmosphere is even slower than that. So I don't really see that being an issue. But I've also learned that not to argue with anyone that that is convinced of something. And I haven't tried it, so I'm just sort of theorizing based on what I imagine going on scientifically in the bottle. But I'll remember that, and I'll probably think about it now every time I take that first pour out of a bottle. So next time we talk, I might have an answer for you based on my experiments I do.
Well, one of the things I'm actually going to do this. I have to get to the grocery store and get some food coloring. But here's how I'm going to actually prove that this is wrong and that the neck pour doesn't exist. Because one, you're assuming that whoever the neck pour advocates are assuming that every bottle is stored perfectly upright, never moving, never changing position, never changing orientation throughout its entire existence, from the bottling hall to the grocery store or the liquor store. And every time you hit a bump in the truck, it's going to get shaken up, and you put it in the back seat of your car, and nobody's ever going to put it perfectly straight up, so it's going to get shaken around. But what I've thought of is, to be able to prove this, is I'm going to fill an empty whiskey bottle up with water, and then put with food colored water, say red or something so you can see it, and then put a little bit of cooking oil on the top to represent that neck pour stuff. And if the neck pour advocates are right, only the oil part should spill into a glass when you pour it at that point, when it's all the way up to the neck. This one's been opened. But if I'm right, it's going to get moved around to the point where the oil is going to stay up here and the whiskey is going to come out the bottom. And you're going to see that colored water in the bottom of the glass. So we will be able to disprove this nonsense once and for all. Let's move on. And as Crumpler points out, well played, Tyrone, with his neck pour like a whiskey hickey. Good comment there. Graham Fraser wants to know, can you say, and you may not know the answer to this, which of the Scottish distilleries in Scotland buy empty Four Roses casks? I'm betting because they go through brokers in Louisville and Lexington. You may not know where they're going. Is that the case?
You're exactly right. We don't have any idea where they go. I can tell you that up until I think 2013 we had a contract with Diageo. And so a lot of what we were distilling and putting away was being shipped to Diageo. And at that time, they got a lot of those barrels. And so they were certainly going to Diageo distilleries. But now it all goes through a broker, and we have no idea where they end up.
This timing of this in 2013 wouldn't have anything to do with, the end of a certain production contract that you guys had to produce whiskey for a certain bourbon brand that comes in an orange label?
Could be coincidence on that timing.
I'm kidding. We know that. I mean, considering that Tom Bullitt has admitted that Four Roses used to produce the original recipe for Bullitt bourbon, and Bullitt was part of Seagram's at one point originally before Diageo got it, so we can acknowledge that. But that deal has been broken for a long time now. Did stuff like that actually, when that contract was broken, that actually freed you guys up to produce more of your own stuff, right?
Yeah, and that was exactly the idea. Like when we were purchased by Kirin, we had a certain production capacity out in the distillery, and we didn't have enough sales of our own liquid in Japan and Europe to really fill like 3 or 4 months of production in our distillery. So it was a really good relationship. They had Bullitt, that was a big brand that had been produced by Seagram's. So we entered that contract. We were producing for them, producing for ourselves. But then as our own demand grew and our case sales, we needed that capacity in the distillery to produce just Four Roses. So that's exactly what happened. We just didn't renew that contract. And we've never, we don't talk about it a lot, and Diageo didn't talk about it a lot, but no one ever treated it as a secret. It wasn't too hard to find out when, on the back of the Bullitt bottle, it said distilled and aged in, or produced in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. I just had to pick up the phone and call around and find out that it was either Wild Turkey or Four Roses or just a PO
and
box.
You guys would actually switch the distillery permits around, the signs around, if I remember correctly, when you were distilling for Bullitt, to actually distill into their DSP as opposed to yours, if I remember correctly.
We may have, I don't recall.
That would have been a question for the late, great Al Young, who we should raise a glass to tonight, because Al was the legend of Four Roses along with Jim, and those guys were running buddies for years. Tell me what Al Young meant to you.
I wouldn't even know where to start. When I first started in 2005, he was the distillery manager. So that was my introduction to him. And so to get to learn from Al, and that's really when our friendship began. So it started out really as he was one of my mentors. So for about 3 years, I got to work closely with him in that capacity. And then at that time, he transferred over into being a brand ambassador, which I think that was really the role he was born to play. You may not know it, but as good as he was at the technical side of distilling and bourbon making, his background was actually in theater. His personality was bigger than life, and he had a real knack for history, real passion for history. So it was perfect. He knew the history. He'd always just been studying. Honestly, he'd lived a lot of it. All of the pertinent history, modern history, he'd been there through Seagram's, through Kirin. So it makes me happy to know that the last 12 years of his life, he was doing something that was, I think, absolutely perfect for him. He got to travel, he got to meet people, tell stories, and anyone that met Al, will always remember him. His kindness, his charisma, his ability to tell the stories and make them interesting. Like, I traveled with him a lot, and I can say he never just told the same story the same way twice. There was always something new, always something interesting. He sprinkle jokes in there. Keep it exciting for probably a lot of us that were always with him hearing these stories, and just because that's the way he operated. So he meant a lot to me. I could even count the ways, that he influenced me and helped me out in my career. And it was just a pleasure to work with him.
Yeah. About maybe a year or two before he passed, he was just up the road here in Philadelphia for a tasting, and I sat down with him around the table with a bunch of people and just stuck a microphone in, and we talked for maybe 20 minutes or so about those stories. And he talked about working with the Old Actors Theater in Louisville.
Yeah.
As a publicist, not even on stage, before he went to work and in the whiskey industry, because he was getting married, and his future wife's father suggested that he needed real work. So he took a job with Seagram's. And if folks want to find that in the WhiskyCast archives, I don't have the episode number memorized offhand, but if you just do a search in there for Al Young, it'll come up. And it's an interview well worth listening to. One of the things that really sets you guys aside from everybody else is this multiplicity of yeast and mash bill recipes. And a lot of folks don't realize that how many different combinations of whiskey you can come up with 2 different mash bills and 5 different yeast styles. Explain how that works for some of our folks, especially over in Europe, that are used to Scotch distilleries that produce one basic style of whiskey almost year round, and then maybe a peated style for a few weeks.
Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting. That really started with Seagram's, and I think they did it for 2 reasons. One was, well, the main reason was for consistency, because the more different flavors you have to create the final product, the more control you have over the final flavor. And the other was they used straight bourbon whiskey in different products, like Canadian blended whiskeys and whatever else. And so they would have certain recipes that had that flavor profile that they wanted in their Crown Royal, or Seagram 7, or whatever it might be. So they had these different yeast strains, these different mash bills, and they did that with all their spirits. They would have different facilities making different spirits, sort of similar to what happens a lot with blended scotches in Scotland. Now, it would be sort of a concert of a lot of different facilities coming together with their liquid to make certain products. But as Seagram's, as different distilleries around Kentucky that were owned by Seagram's were shut down, some of these recipes that were produced in different facilities kept getting absorbed by the remaining distilleries, until finally we were the last distillery standing. And so we absorbed all those recipes that were needed to create those blended whiskeys and to create Four Roses bourbon. And it just so happened to be those 10 recipes. And again, they defined quality through the consistency. If it was consistent, it was quality. So they could make, it was easy to make good whiskey, but to make it consistent, that's a little more difficult, because you can't do much to control the flavor. We have all the science, we have all the technology and the equipment, and we know exactly how to make good whiskey, but we're at the mercy of water, grains, weather, wood. There's so many variables that go into the final quality of any barrel of whiskey. And that's kind of what makes it magic. That's really keeps it interesting. There is that art on top of the science in making that. But with those different recipes, you have that control at the end. So after all the variables have contributed and made all their little differences from barrel to barrel, batch to batch, you have that variety so that you can bring those together to make a consistent product. And that's what we always use those recipes for in the Four Roses bourbon. But in 2006, now we did it with the super premium in Japan. That was, different recipes, different flavor profile from single barrel or from the Four Roses bourbon. But in 2006, when we came out with a small batch year, that was really the first time in the U.S. market that we really took advantage of that versatility, to be able to create something absolutely different just by pulling different proportions or different recipes together to create something new. And again, that goes back to the Four Roses small batch platform. And because we love that versatility, we're very proud of it. We're proud of our 10 recipes. That's really one of the best ways we have to showcase that. And of course, we have the private barrels, and we have and those, you can get those in all 10 recipes. So that's fantastic. but they're not easy to find. They're highly sought after. We only do about 55 barrels a month, and those are primarily just in the U.S. So it's a little hard to find those. So the best way to really experience the difference is just to look at small batch versus Four Roses Bourbon versus small batch select. And those differences, there's some differences in age, differences in proof, but really the big difference comes from the different yeast strains and different mash bills that are used.
Do you have a personal favorite among the 10 recipes?
Not really. Different. They're all good, and there's a time and a place. I don't really have a favorite of our standard lineup either. There's a time and a place, or time of day, or they're all good at certain different periods of time, or for whatever reasons.
Are there some of those, though, that hold up better, say, with water or an ice cube compared to the other recipes?
Possibly, but I would say the biggest difference, because it's hard to really say which is my favorite, but the biggest difference is how they age and what kind of characteristics you get out of certain ones. Because some certainly age better. Some are better, I think, at younger ages. Some are better at older ages. A good example of that would be our Q recipe, our Q yeast strain. Historically, that was only used in Four Roses Bourbon, just in a small percentage, and it still is. That's because at 5-6 years old, that's the floral yeast strain, by the way. So it's like a potpourri, very, very floral aroma and flavor. So at 5 or 6 years old, it's matured, but it's still young enough that it has all those bright flavors and aromas from the original fermentation. So when we came out with the private barrel program, we didn't have any Qs that were aged that old. And I remember thinking, this won't be a home run. This is really just a top note. For me, at 5-6 years old, it doesn't really stand alone like a V or a K. It seems a little one-dimensional. But I was very surprised because once you age that out to 8, 9, 10 years, some of those more ethereal, bright, floral notes, they kind of come down as the oak, the vanillas, the caramels, as those increase, they kind of meet at a crossroads and they create a really nice candied flavor. So that was a surprise and something that, I'm always learning and always being surprised, but that was a big one to see just how much that changed in 3 years. But then if you go out farther than that, if you go out 13, 14, 15 years, in many cases, the Qs to me, and all barrels have a time where they really start to go over the hill. They start to lose the vibrant original bourbon character. But for me, in a lot of cases, the Q seems to burn out sooner than some of the others. I think the Ks age very well. I really like you said, what's your favorite recipe at 13 years old, 14 years old? I could easily say that's probably OESV or OESK. My favorite at 7 or 8 years is probably OBSV. And that's what the single barrel is. I didn't make that decision to make that the product for single barrel, but it was an excellent decision because I think at that age, that's when that recipe is really at its peak. The Fs, I like those. They change through time. It's hard to say what age period I prefer for the Fs, but maybe 8, 9 years on those. So I get asked that a lot, and usually I don't dive in too deep because I end up talking about it because it's not an easy question to answer.
Oh, it's fine.
I do have favorite recipes, but there's some caveats to it. At certain ages, it might be this recipe, but just to give a blanket statement, this is my favorite recipe, that's really hard.
And for those who have not heard or are not familiar with the 4-letter code, O is consistent among all of them because that means it was distilled at Four Roses, but the other 3 letters can change, right?
Correct, yeah. The second letter, that designates the mash bill. We have 2 mash bills, the B and the E. The B mash bill is very high in rye. It's 35%. The E is still relatively high, but lower than the B. It's 20%. And then the last letter, that designates the yeast strain. So we have an O yeast strain, which is very rich and fruity, a K, which is spicy, a V, which is more of a delicate fruity flavor, the Q, which is the floral that I was speaking of, and then the F. The F is kind of herbal, a little minty, clove-like. So we've got the range from nice spice, baking spice flavors and aromas to floral to fruit.
And the third letter is the S, and that's always the same as well, right?
Yeah, that's always just straight bourbon whiskey. And the O, this is interesting. When I mentioned that Seagram's had multiple distilleries around the state of Kentucky, they were all the whiskey was being stored or warehoused at the same location. So that's why we needed those codes. And at the beginning, the O, that designated this distillery in Lawrenceburg, because this distillery, when it was built, wasn't Four Roses. It wasn't part of the Seagram's family at all. It was actually Old Prentice. And so the O designated Old Prentice, meaning that it originated here in Lawrenceburg. So everything now is O for the first letter, and S, everything's S. That's straight bourbon whiskey. So the first and the third letter, they don't change, but we keep them anyway. We're kind of nostalgic, I guess.
I did not know that about Old Prentice. That's something I had not heard until just now. What else do you know about the history there, going back that far in the pre-Seagram's days?
Not a lot. There are a few distilleries on the site. Old Joe was here right across the street. The distillery was built in 1910, and it was in production up to Prohibition. It was shut down then and reopened, and it was purchased, I think it was 46 by Seagram's. So Seagram's bought the Four Roses brand in 43. They didn't buy this facility until 46 or 47. And so sometime after that period is when the two sort of started to come together. But even when they came together, all Four Roses wasn't produced here. It was still being produced at some of these other Kentucky distilleries.
And that's the way it was back then, is that you had multiple distilleries producing the same product and just blending it all together.
Uh-huh.
We have a little bit of fun here. Dave Kuhn wants to know, have you guys ever had an April Fool's joke where you announced you're changing the name to Five Roses?
No one's thrown that one out yet, but I'll make a note of that. I will say, when we introduced the Small Batch Select, we kind of marketed that as the Fifth Rose.
And Dave Kuhn, given that it's the Kentucky State flower, 4 goldenrods would seem appropriate, according to Chris Ratcliffe. And they're also pointing out that actually goldenrod would be a great name for a whiskey. I hadn't thought about that one. This should be a fairly easy one for you. Graham Fraser wants to know, and he's from the UK, where they do still use a lot of generic distiller's yeast. You guys cultivate and store your own 5 yeast strains, right? These are not typical distiller's yeasts that anyone can buy off the shelf.
No, these have been isolated through the years, because of the characteristics they create through fermentation. And we don't store them long-term on site. We store them all with White Labs out in San Diego. So they store all the strains. They do quality control to make sure they don't mutate or change over time. They keep them like frozen at -80 degrees. They won't change. But every month, when we know what we're going to produce, we put an order in, and they send us 2 or 3 yeast strains, however many we need for that month, and then we propagate them in-house. We start out in the lab and then transfer it out to the donut tub in the distillery, and then to the yeast stubs, and then on to the fermenters. And that's a tough process. I mean, it's almost like a parallel process to the fermentation. Everything's up to distillation. It's a more complicated process even than the mashing and inoculation and big fermentation that goes on in the distillery.
And Chris Ratcliffe wants to know, is there an 11th recipe that you'd like to try? How much R&D work are you guys doing on mash bills and fermentations now, or is 10 recipes enough?
Well, 10 recipes, it gives us so much variety that we could keep exploring different flavor profiles for years and never hit the same profile twice. But I'm always interested in trying something new, seeing what else we could do. The problem for the last 8-9 years has been that the demand has been a lot higher than what we can actually produce. But recently, well, in 2015, we started to expand our distillery. We've doubled our capacity. We just finished that up not even 2 years ago. So we do have some extra capacity now. It's filling up quickly because the demand isn't slowing at all. So there could be some opportunity to try something out. Now that we're kind of shifting gears, we're not just trying to catch up. It is an opportunity to maybe get ahead and play around, but we don't have any plans for that just yet. So we'll see.
Fun comment here from Watchman 999. OBSV, obviously the best strain to vat. Okay, we'll give him that one. Spirit Bomb Tabitha wants to know, what's your favorite cocktail to make using Four Roses?
I have pretty simple tastes when it comes to cocktails. I really like old fashions.
And that was before we put the comment up on the screen from Watchman. If he doesn't say old fashioned, I'd be surprised. But Kentucky Paralyzer, that could be an interesting one now. Dave Kuhn says on your website, the Pieces of the Past section on the heritage page of the site is cool with the old branding. And he wants to know if you've ever thought about reviving any of that for a special bottling. The old 100 proof look is great. You actually did that a couple of years ago with Al Young's 50th anniversary bottling. That came from 1967, if I remember right.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that was, I still love looking at that bottle because it's a beautiful bottle and it was just perfect. We were commemorating Al's 50th anniversary with the company. And that was the bottle that was on the shelf in 1967 when he started. So what we did is we got an old bottle. We had a few here in the archives, and we sent it off, and so they put it in like a laser chamber so they could get the exact dimensions, and they recreated that bottle exactly, except for the cap. The one from 67 had a screw cap. We thought it'd be nicer to put a cork in Al's bottle. But it was well received, a beautiful package. And you're right, we have a lot of old bottles, old decanters, old designs. So someday we may try to do some kind of a throwback bottle. I think it'd be really neat to do that again, do just like we did with the Al's bottle.
And I am actually trying to see if I can find my tasting notes for that one. And I can't find it so that I could actually pull the picture of the bottle up, because you may have one handy there, don't you? Or might you?
Actually, I have one of the bottles right here. Yeah.
Perfect. That's what it looked like back in 1967.
Yeah, it's a beautiful bottle.
Graham Fraser wants to know if you have any plans to ever do a wheated whiskey or a wheated bourbon, a la the Van Winkle type bourbons or makers. You guys do everything with rye.
Yeah, we do, and we always talk about, that's part of our uniqueness. But I like wheated whiskeys. I don't think just because that's sort of what we're known for, I don't think that's a reason not to do a wheated whiskey. There's so many of those that I really like. I'd be interested in seeing how what a wheated whiskey would turn out like, from our distillery. So, but seems like a lot of interest in a straight rye whiskey from Four Roses. Again, because that's kind of the flavor profile that people associate with us in terms of straight bourbon whiskeys, that extra bit of rye. So I don't know what we would between the two. I don't know which one would come first if we decide to add an 11th recipe or 12th recipe. But yeah,
I would love to taste the Four Roses rye.
You would what? I'm sorry.
I would love to taste a Four Roses rye with the different yeast strains you've got, and to try those, or as well as a wheater. But I'd love to try a Four Roses straight rye.
Yeah,
if you get a chance to get some of that excess capacity to work and make a rye up once in a while.
We get that request a lot, more than a wheated whiskey. But a lot of people are surprised when I say, "Yeah, I think it'd be nice to try wheated whiskey here at Four Roses." But maybe in the future, we'll see.
Tabitha, Spirit Bomb, have you ever done any finishing in any other types of casks like rum, sherry, or port? I know a bunch of other Kentucky bourbons have been finished off, but is that something you'd ever just consider as an experiment, just to play with it?
Possibly just to play with. We haven't done that yet, and so we don't have any products on the market that have been finished in any way, but I've tasted a lot of good ones. and I'm pretty interested in it. But I'll never say never. It really could be something we would experiment with in the future.
I have to ask, I know that this year the Kentucky Bourbon Festival is actually going to have special bottlings from each distillery. Can you give us any hint of what you've cooked up yet for those guys?
Yeah, nothing's been finalized yet. Not even keeping it from you. I don't know yet.
What about this year's limited edition small batch? You were talking about how some of those recipes aged when they got to 10 to 15 years. I remember last year's limited edition small batch had, if I remember right, some 15, 16-year-old whiskey in there.
Yeah, and I think some 19-year-old too, maybe 20. Either the 19 or the 20th limited edition. Both those had some older whiskey, some 19 and some 20-year-old. I think there was about 20%. That's right. It was about 20% of a 19-year-old in last year's blend. So yeah, they're always at least 10 years of age. And the average age of most of them is somewhere between 15, 17 years. So it's usually 3 or 4 batches of older whiskey that's been set aside just because it's aging very well. It's not getting too oaky. It's still interesting, still vibrant. So it's really kind of like the hand-picked batches that we pull together once a year. And it's really the most fun thing I get to do every year, just revisit those batches that have been sitting there that are getting some of that extra age and putting test blends together to try to create something that's totally unique, totally smooth, mellow, and again, demonstrates the versatility with the recipes. But yeah, this year's is complete. We'll be bottling that probably in July, maybe June, and it'll hit the market in Kentucky in September. And a lot of that goes to Europe also. Japan they haven't gotten any the last 2 years, but Europe gets a healthy amount, and of course the U.S. gets roughly about 14,000 bottles each year.
Give me a sense of your process of creating that blend of the different recipes for the limited edition small batch. Where do you start each year, and do you start from a clean slate?
Yeah, it's a clean slate. The slate is always, or the palette of potential recipes is always being added to, because we're always pulling batches, looking at samples, doing test blends, basically continually surveying what we have in inventory. So while we're doing this, these certain batches, like I mentioned, that seem to be aging very well or are unique for whatever reason, or maybe they really exhibit the characteristics of that particular recipe they're supposed to exhibit, those batches, I'll pull a tier, 2 tiers, 3 tiers, and just set them aside and sort of reserve those to potentially be used for limited edition. And then typically around October, November, I just have to wait until all the hot weather, so they're kind of in suspended maturation. They're always maturing, but slows down a little bit more in the cooler months. So I'll pull samples of, it could be 20, 25 different batches of those batches that are aged 10 to 22, 23 years, whatever it might be. And then that's where the fun really begins, because I set them all up and we evaluate each one of those batches. And, it's always hard to know where to start. I kind of have it down to a process where I'll go through all the batches, and it's so much information. There's so much good whiskey, so many directions that the blend could go in, that first thing I do is try to narrow it down. I'll start getting some ideas when I'm looking at these batches, and I usually spend a week or two just getting very familiar with all of those. I'll typically pare it down to 6 or 7 batches, and then begin on like 2 or 3 different directions, because you'll smell 2 different batches and think, this one's maybe super spicy, but a hint of fruit, maybe too much oak. But this batch over here that's so mellow, a little light on the oak, heavy on the herbal notes or whatever it might be, I think these two would go together. This might create a good direction. And that's just an example of, all the different ideas. And there are an infinite number of ideas that start coming to mind when you're looking at this many good batches. So I'll usually pick 2 or 3 different directions and test blend those up, and then blindly go through those. And If one of those works, two of those works, great. Might start refining that direction. Or if none of those really hit the mark, then start with a new idea. So it's basically like creating different paths and then just inching down one or two paths and refining those percentages, the recipes, until it's time to finalize it, because we've got to start moving forward with artwork and everything else. There's never a point where it's like, this is done. I always want to keep working on it because it's a lot of fun, and there's really never that point where you can't improve it, because you can always keep, there's so many choices of batches and percentages. So it's just getting to that point where you say, this is great. I can't improve on it too much more, and we've got to go ahead and just select this one and move forward with it. So it takes anywhere from 2 to 3 months. And it's not like 8 hours a day. It's a little bit here and there. Typically, when I'm working on something like that, it's in the mornings when I think my senses are a little bit keener, before lunch. And, just a few days a week, spend an hour or two. And with something like that, you want to go back to it again and again. If you did it all in a day, and I've done this, I've gotten, especially when I first started working on these, I would get excited and start looking at the batches and start throwing them together, and was sure that I'd just blended the best whiskey known to man. And then come back the next day or after lunch, think, not so fast. Go back to the drawing board. It's good, but it's not nearly what you thought it was. So it takes a lot of time to see the whiskey from all angles, different times of day, and at different dilutions. That's one that's typically, you assume everyone's going to drink it at barrel strength or bottling strength, and it's the way I'm going to be drinking it. But it's always nice to add a little bit of water and see some of those other nuanced flavors that come out of it. I think that's important when blending.
You just brought up an interesting point. You say your senses are heightened in the morning compared to the evening, which I know is when a lot of us are drinking whiskey. When is the best time, you think, to actually do your serious evaluations?
I've never done any serious evaluations in the evening, but I would say my palate's pretty good at night. I'm pretty sure of that. But in the lab, like when I'm not really enjoying whiskey, when it's more of an evaluation and I'm trying to be, very precise and scientific about it, it's really best probably like an hour to two before lunch. I usually have a pretty light breakfast, so I'm somewhat hungry, and I have nothing's been on my palate for several hours. For me, I think that's when my sense of smell is most keen. But sort of back to what I was saying, even I could taste it then. I'm looking at it that way, and might say this is it. This is the limited edition formula. This has got to be it. But I would not approve that until I took a sample home and tasted it in the evening, because really that's the test. Because that's when people are going to be drinking. That's when I'm going to be enjoying it. And it usually is different, whether it's the environment, the time of day, whatever it may be. But that's where I was saying, trying to look at it at all different angles. Because with something like whiskey that's so complex, you have to take your time with it and really evaluate it in every way you possibly can.
Do you have your own personal blend of Four Roses that you've never bottled, but that you keep some at home?
No, but I would say probably the closest thing to that would be the Select. Because a lot of times, when I'm doing limited editions, that's sort of a blank slate. It could be whatever. But in doing test blends for small batch, Four Roses bourbon, even selecting single barrels or batches for single barrel, those profiles have been established. So what I'm basically trying to do is just make sure that's consistent every month, every year, just continually consistent. But with small batch Select, that was interesting, because that was, I knew that was going to be the next pillar of our portfolio, and there was really no guideline. There wasn't a standard. So really the way I approached that, and this is kind of the discussion I had with myself going into it. It's like, there's really no clear direction. So I'm going to make something that I like. I'm just going to bring the recipes together in a way that pleases me. And I have experience. I know that I'm aligned with most people's tastes. I'm not way out in left field. So I really didn't have any other beacon other than to just follow my own preference. So that's exactly what I did. So if there was a blend, and it's true for the limited editions too, every year it's kind of like that. But with this one, 6 and 7 year old whiskeys, and it was really the best blend I could put together that spoke to me or that I really enjoyed. So I guess I'm fortunate. Yeah, I guess there is kind of a blend, and I can pick it up any day down at my local store.
So how much of your innovation in blending is driven by the marketing department versus what you come up with and say, hey guys, we need to bottle this. This is good.
Really all that originates in the lab. We get direction, like with Small Batch Select. And we're a small company, so it's not like we get a call from marketing and it's some anonymous person that we've never met. We all talk and stay in contact. So it was a conversation. Everyone sort of gave their input on what our strengths are, what we should play on, where the gaps might be, what the modern consumer is looking for. And so it was a conversation that sort of led us in the direction of Small Batch Select. I guess there's direction. It's kind of unspoken, but it had to be different from the other products. And, from there, that was really kind of where I started. And I knew it needed to be different and sort of put it together, with that in mind. I'll tell you an interesting, bringing Al up, he was, when we started doing the 50th, he'd been on the tasting panel years back when he was anyone in operations is on the panel. So he'd been on the panel, had an excellent palate, and he still did a lot of tastings, especially with private barrel selections, but he hadn't really been in the lab in, almost 9 years when we started doing the Als 50th. So I went to him first thing, and there was some direction. That's the most direction I've gotten in starting with a blend. He said, I want some older stuff in it, and I want it to be very different. And so it's like, very different was great. And I was like, that sounds good. We'll throw in some Q's, some F's, something maybe that we don't do very often. But the older, that really was sort of challenging because I'm not a big fan of a lot of oak. And we had the older whiskey. We could put out oak bombs with all day long because we do have some of that older whiskey, but we just keep enough around to kind of blend with the younger stuff to try to create that complexity. But we've never pushed it, and I'd never pushed it. I've always been a little bit reluctant to dive too much into the extra age stuff, but Al was insistent he wanted older whiskey in it. So we used some 23-year-old, and that's the oldest we've used in anything. And it was a challenge, and I didn't want to disappoint him. I didn't want to be like, oh, we can't do that, Al. But we worked together on blending it from day one, and I pulled that 23-year-old, and it really sort of pushed out of the limits of what I would have typically tried. So that was probably the most direction, we've ever had from anyone when it comes to, how we're going to blend, what we're going to do. And he knew exactly what he wanted, and I think it turned out fantastic. And again, I'm so happy that it did. The packaging, the liquid, Al was so proud of that, and he should be. It's wonderful.
Where is the sweet spot for you in terms of aging?
It depends on the batch. Probably the best answer would be, I like the point where there's enough oak that it's not dry, it's not astringent. And I think that sort of happens first. You go out beyond that, the oak almost falls apart and gets resinous, and it's almost like a wet blanket. It really kills some of the more vibrant characteristics. And I can see that some people enjoy that flavor, but it's kind of flat and not super complex. For some barrels that could be 14 years old, 12 years old. Some barrels it's 23, 25 years old. It's all different. That's sort of the job of distillers, to know the barrels in the warehouse and use them before they get to that stage. But I like it so before it hits that astringent or bitter point, and also before it loses that character that really makes it bourbon. Whether it's that vibrant spice or fruit, whatever it may be, depending on whatever bourbon it is or whatever the profile it is. Any bourbon, once it ages too long, it's going to lose some of that original character. So it's that sweet spot, that balance right there where it all comes together. And it's different for every barrel.
Do you have a honey spot in the warehouses that you like to pick from?
No, I get asked that a lot. Our warehouses by design are very consistent. They're all on the same property. They're all at the same elevation. They're all single story. So by design, we don't have that much variation. Like I said, if we go out long enough in the age, we will get some based on the elevation in the warehouse or the tier that it's on. But when I'm evaluating batches, I'm looking more at the age and the recipe and not really keeping an eye on where it is in the warehouse. But I know a lot of people do, and they swear by certain areas or certain warehouses. And again, I won't argue with them.
And it's interesting because I know there are warehouses right across the road from your distillery that you don't control. If I remember right,
yeah,
the warehouses right across from the distillery are owned by Wild Turkey, right?
That's right, yeah. They used to be Seagram's. We used to age over there, but when when Seagram's built the warehouses outside of Bardstown, we passed these on, sold them to Wild Turkey, and they're still in use.
Love this question from James Morgan. Barrel picks have been getting good reviews from Four Roses. Do you have any advice on how to find the best store picks for your whiskeys?
There's some good Facebook groups and other groups out there that are dedicated, some specifically to Four Roses, actually. And that's a good resource. There's really no pattern to it. I can't say, every 6 months you're going to need a good one in Arizona or California. It's all up to the stores and how we allocate in the different markets. So it's hard to really give any solid advice. I would just say make calls, keep your eyes and ears open, and make friends with some retailers locally, especially, it's hard to say. Well, good luck.
Do you tell them all, hey, you're getting the best barrel? I wish I could bottle this barrel as a single barrel. Or do you tell them all that? Or do you guide them as they're picking barrels?
I sit in on the occasional barrel pick. I wish I could do more. I love doing them. I might do one a month at most. But what I'll typically do, if I'm there with a group of people, I'll find out what kind of input they want from me. I'd like just to stand back, let them make their decision, and then I'll give them my honest assessment of the barrels. But they're usually, all those batches and barrels, we've already looked through them and selected them. So there aren't going to be any duds in there. They're all going to be very good barrels. It's really just a matter of personal preference when it gets to that level. So, and I always try to be very clear about that. So, there's always a lot of discussion. Typically, if I have it my way, after they already select their barrel. But there are times where they're like, no, we want your vote. And, we'll just count you as like another guest. And I enjoy that. I really don't want people to use, it's, like I said, they're all good barrels. At that point, it's just personal preference. There's not a bad pick. And it's pretty interesting because I think in the last few years, people that come in for barrel picks have a lot more confidence and they understand that. And I love seeing that when people know what they want. Like there are guests that might say, good for you. You know what you like.
They're writing the check. Graham Fraser, are there any of the spirits that you like to drink apart from Four Roses? Any single malts in particular? What else do you drink?
Yeah. If I'm not drinking bourbon, usually it's beer, but I do like single malts. I like a lot of them. Little known fact is all of the Four Roses bourbon that's like the 80 proof that's sold in Europe is bottled just outside of Edinburgh with it used to be the Chivas Regal facility. Then it was Benriach. Now it's owned by Brown Forman. So before I was master distiller, when I was just doing quality control, I'd go over to Benriach every year, and I love it over there. I would go and visit different distilleries and try different single malts, different scotches, and I haven't met one I didn't like. I really enjoy the variety and the different styles. So I was really partial, though, to like the Glendronachs and the Benriachs, the ones that were produced by the gang there at that facility. I had a lot of exposure to those, and you've got a lot of variety with both of those finishes, just a wide array of flavors. But yeah, I enjoy a lot of Scotch whiskeys. I probably maybe have a glass every few months. A lot of times, like if I have guests over, it's a good experience. I like to pull out different bourbon whiskeys, and it always ends up being sort of an educational type experience. And that's when I'll typically pull out some Scotch whiskeys or some Irish whiskeys and illustrate the differences and explain the differences. And so it's fun for me too, because then I get to revisit some of these old bottles that I don't pull out very often.
And Tyrone Cote followed up on that one. If Four Roses were a Scotch, which one would it be?
I don't know, but I would think it would be like a Highland Scotch. Very not overly, kind of bright, estery, fruity, lighter. But as far as a particular brand, I don't know. But I have noticed that it seems like, in doing tastings through the years, I inevitably have, the people that come up to want to try Four Roses that say, I like Scotch whiskey. I'm not too crazy about bourbons. And it seems like the feedback I get from people is that people with a palate for, some of the lighter Scotches, some, again, fruitier or more bright Scotches, Four Roses almost seems like it works very well as a gateway bourbon for people that have that type of Scotch-oriented palate.
That's an interesting. I was thinking more almost like a Brook Laddie in terms of the three different whiskey styles that they make there, compared to your 5 different styles. Donner Pass Whiskey is curious about batch variation between the small batches. He bought a Dusty on a shelf 4 years ago, and it was magic, but went back to get another shiny new bottle from a new batch, and the magic wasn't there. How much variation is there in between small batches in the small batch?
There shouldn't be any. That's kind of disappointing to hear that, because we go to a lot of effort to select the right batches and always look at previous bottlings to blend to hit that same flavor target. So there really shouldn't be any variation.
And Dave Kuhn, how much is too much to pay for a bottle of Four Roses limited edition? It's hard to find a bottle at retail price these days because of some scoundrels that like to empty your pockets. What do you think when you see what some retailers do to your bottles because you can't tell them what they can sell it for?
It's hard to put an actual price tag on that. I guess it's I don't know, but it is sort of a shame when you see some of the prices. A lot of people seem to get angry at the secondary market or, retailers. I understand that we're selling to them for a certain price and they should pass along to the consumer, with whatever markup. The secondary market prices, that's just a free market at work there. It's going to command whatever the demand is. So on one hand, it's like, wow, that's amazing, that bottle. People are looking for that bottle that much. But on the other hand, it's like, I hate that people have to pay $500 to be able to try something that we're so proud of that I wish everyone could just get a bottle of. So it's tough to really answer that.
And Whiskey Canuck, some distilleries have travel retail exclusives. Are you doing anything that we should keep an eye out for once we're getting on planes again, at least? I've not seen a Four Roses travel retail. Maybe those 2 Japanese variants.
I don't know if we've done those in Japan in like duty free. In Europe, we'll occasionally, we have Kirin Europe or Four Roses Europe that markets through all the European countries, and sometimes they'll do their own promotions that could include some travel retail, but I don't think we're doing anything currently here in the U.S.
Okay, I think that pretty much does it for tonight. When will we get the word on this year's limited edition small batch? I think Dave Kuhn wanted to know the answer to that one. Those come out usually in September, right?
Yeah, they'll hit the shelves in Kentucky in September. It'll be a little bit after that in some other states, but actually Europe will probably get it about that time too. That's the reason we bottle it so much earlier, is you got to put it on the ships and ship them over. And the UK gets a lot of those bottles, and in Europe too, but the UK gets quite a bit.
And the idea is to get it out in time for the Bourbon Festival in mid-September, right?
Yeah, but some states, it might be even early next year for certain states, but most of the states in the U.S. will get it before December, September, October, November. So.
Well, Brent, I want to thank you for giving us an hour and 17 minutes of your time that you'll never get back tonight. Thank you for doing this. It's been great.
Great questions. And,
I can't wait to be able to travel again, because I need to get out to Lawrenceburg and see you guys. It's been far too long.
Oh, yeah, and I should mention, a few things. We are expanding. We're building a new visitor center, so that will be finished toward the end of this year in the fall, and it's going to be
okay.
We've outgrown the old space. We weren't in that very long before we outgrew it, and this is going to be fantastic. And something else we're doing is we're going to offer both small batches in 50 ml bottles. So that'll be interesting. It'll be a first for us, again, because we're always talking about the differences. So now people will get you don't have to buy two 750s to figure out which one you like better. You can just, invest $5 or $6 in each one of those, taste them, and really, experience the whole, our uniqueness in much more easily.
Have you ever thought about doing a fill your own bottle thing there from a single cask?
No, but everything, the whole bourbon tourism, the laws are changing. So maybe that would be something we could do in the future. It'd be really great. I think people would enjoy that.
I know that the folks in Scotland have a lot of fun with those. And I think being able to do that in Kentucky, to fill your own single barrel bourbon bottle, I think that would be just absolutely neat. Final thought from Donner Pass Whiskey must say, if I was to buy a bottle of bourbon, not likely, Donner Pass is into single malts, we know this, it would be the Small Batch Select. It looks intriguing. And I can tell you, after tasting it before and then for the last hour or so, yes, it is intriguing. You should try some.
Absolutely.
Brent, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Give our best to all the folks out at the distillery, and stay safe. And hopefully I'll see you in the next few months here before we can get out there soon.
Well, it's good catching up, even if it is just virtually. And thanks, everyone, for joining in. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you. And let me, Brent, stand by for just a second here. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. Don't forget, next week, 5 o'clock New York time, 2100 GMT, Brian Kinsman, the malt master for William Grant & Sons, everything except the Balvenie, Glenfiddich, along with Tullamore Dew, and Gibson's in Canada. He does a little bit of everything, and he'll join us on the webcast next Friday night. Once again, 5 p.m. New York time, 2100 GMT, 2200 in London. And thank you again for watching and listening. And we'll see you on the podcast this weekend. Good night, everyone. Stay safe.